I am Sylvia CASSANO. I am a Vermont Master Composter, and I am doing a segment today to teach you about composting for the Bennington County Solid Waste Alliance. I'm holding a jar of final product compost. So compost is essentially broken down organic matter, so it becomes more usable. And it started out, what was in here probably started out like that. So composting would enhance soil structure and helps increase soil health and stability. So a lot of farmers use compost or make compost. It saves landfill space, so that's a big thing here in Vermont. That's why we're talking about composting. Compost in a landfill without air produces more methane gas, which is more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The compost process, what is it? When you're cooking in your kitchen or eating your breakfast in the morning, you might come up with little things like banana peels. This was from my lunch yesterday, an avocado. So you need a place to store that temporarily until you can pay attention to your compost piles. This is from the Bennington County Solid Waste Alliance. This is a bin you could store on your counter, you could store under your sink. A method that my family likes to use are these old coffee bins. Some people store them in bags in their freezer if they have a big freezer. 5-gallon bin, bucket, it's up to you. In here, we lined this with a paper bag because then we can just pull the paper bag out. So I can take some of my scraps like my lemon, my bananas, my kale, a lot of coffee grinds. This is great for compost. So these are all good to compost. I don't want to compost meat or cheese or maybe like hard-boiled eggs or things like that because it can attract rodents. We don't want to draw animals to our compost pile or create a smell. And they take a long time to degrade. So what else might you not compost? These are compostable utensils that I got with my lunch, and I can compost them if I know they're going into a facility like TAM, but in my home pile, it's not going to work. They will take forever. And then cardboard will take a long time to break down, so just recycle cardboard as normal. A paper bag, newspaper, that's fine, but this is thick enough that just recycle it normally. But anything in here, we can just put in there. I have some beans. All this stuff I could be putting in the garbage, but I'm composting it. Corn on the cob, I actually cut it a lot smaller. It's like things like that. This I might cut smaller. That's why my banana peels are in half. Things compost better when they're smaller. If you have time to cut them up smaller, do it, because that will help speed up the process. So this whole thing I know is compostable, so I'll show you later what I'm gonna do with that. We are over here near my compost system, so I'm going to talk about the difference between the compost, which we say is the green, so you're adding the green compost, so it's wet, fresh material. This is the greens. What are the browns? The browns are the carbon source that we are adding to our compost pile. So we would add 1 part of green to 2 parts of brown. Here I have a few examples. Depends on what you have available. You could use some sort of shredded newspaper. This is time consuming, but you could use it if that's all you had. This time of year in summer, you could take your lawn, your grass clippings if you have that ability, and use those. And then in the fall, you could rake up your leaves. This has a lot of pine needles in it, but and this is wet, so you want dry leaves. Probably chopped up more than this would, similar to your greens, would be more effective. It's still better than not adding browns, but if you can also store these things under cover or in a big bin, that's also a really great idea. This is just how we do it here, but it's not as dry as it could be. So one other option I like to do in winter is just sometimes adding either sawdust, if you have that, or these are alfalfa pellets. We just do this in the winter just every once in a while to keep the pile a little warm. So in the spring it's ready to go. One of the things to pay attention to with a bin system like this is the aeration of it. So it does have some vent holes. There's all the different kinds of models, but this one even has vent holes here. So when you put the lid back on, depending on how it's doing inside, you might not want to close it all the way down. You want to keep the air going, but you also would take a tool and reach down in and try to just make sure you loosen it up once in a while. One of the issues currently with this compost bin, you can see how this is sticking together. So stirring it helps break up these blocks. This is also really warm right now, so I know it's breaking down because I've put in the appropriate amount of greens versus browns. So if I were to add a bunch of lettuce to it now, I can't just leave it there. This lettuce has so much moisture in it. I want to make sure I at least add, I'm going to start with an equal amount of browns just to cover it, and then I need to add a little more. So it's 2 parts browns to 1 part of the green. Hopefully that will help keep the moisture issue down with the new greens that I've added. But if the pile is a little too wet anyhow, before I add the greens, I might add another layer of carbon, then the greens, then another layer of the browns or the carbon. If you're checking your bin or your cylinder in this case, if you're noticing that when you pick up the compost, it's feeling really dry, you might want to add some water. You don't want to drown it, but you might just add a small amount and just kind of gauge if that helped make a difference. If you're not adding any greens that have a ton of moisture in it, this would be great. But if you know that you're adding something to it, like watermelon rind or something with a lot, or the lettuce, you might not need to do that. This I honestly hardly do, but it's good to know that will help the microbes do their job, because if the pile's too dry, it's not going to be as effective. With this compost bin system, it has a door at the bottom, which theoretically is supposed to be I can pull my finished compost out, but you can see, yikes, I haven't stirred this pile in a long time, at least down here. It is thick, and look, it is, well, there's worms, so they're helping, but it's not really doing much right now, and it's cold compared to the top of my pile, which is more active. So I can't use this in my garden right now. This is not done. So to troubleshoot that, that means I need to stir this pile more, and I need to get down to the bottom. So I have a spaded fork that I got at a flea market. It's your pitchfork is not going to work. You want something with a little more edge and structure, but basically pushing this down along the edge, and it really is hard to get all the way to the bottom with this being so full, which is why you want to stir it preferably once or twice a week, and if possible, because your compost will just work, do its thing that much faster. Like, I'm having a really hard time moving this around right now. So one of the steps could be you stir it more often when it's half full, and maybe use some of that compost or move it if it has finished, or maybe take something else and poke it along the edge that's maybe more like a broomstick, just to at least give it more air. So even me just doing this along the edge, I'm at least getting some air along it, even if I can't turn the pile. So it's better than nothing. The air helps the microbes get into the compost and start the breakdown process. If it's all compressed, nothing is going to happen at an efficient rate. So you might as well just keep stirring. So another troubleshooting issue would be, what if this pile smells? That could be a result of you not stirring it enough. It could be you added cheese and meat and eggs or things that you shouldn't add. It could also mean that the pile's too wet. So if it were too wet, again, you would add your browns. You have to gauge how wet it is and keep that ratio in mind of the 1 part greens to 2 parts browns. So if I come to my pile and I want to add, say I was adding a whole thing full of this and I noticed it smelled, I think I'm going to wait to add my compost, and I'm going to add some browns first. So maybe I add my newspaper before I add my new greens. And then I want to make sure once I add my new greens that I also add enough of the browns. It might still smell for a little while, but you need to just keep stirring the pile. And if the smell is still a problem, spreading some sort of sawdust or something else to help create heat and cancel out the smell might help until your pile is back in control. So if you have space in your yard to have a bin system, you can, certainly complement it with something like this, but this is sort of a rough 3-bin system that needs a little bit of love. But essentially I took an old pallet and some chicken wire to line it and created some sort of edge. The theory behind the 3-bin system, whether you have it structured as I do or not, is one pile is always your working pile, so the one that you're adding things to. And at some point when that's full or starting to compost, you then would have it go to a different bin. So this isn't quite finished. It's getting there. This has some, the pine needles and leaves are still a little thick, not quite done. There might still be some weed seeds in there because that pile in this stage isn't as hot as a pile you're just adding to. So it's breaking down, but it's breaking down slower at this point. And then eventually it would get into a 3rd bin, or which is more finished. So you can see this starting to look more like soil. And when I squeeze it, it is has just enough moisture that maybe I get 1 drop of water out of it, and that's what we want. This is pretty good stuff. How I might start this pile would be to make a layer of browns on the bottom, because I don't want my juicy greens to drip through to the ground. Since I'm starting the pile, the center, no matter what, is always going to be the hottest in a compost pile. That's where the most action happens, and that's why when you stir your pile, it'll be important to pull whatever's on the outside to the inside. So this is my food scraps. There's a lot of watermelon rinds in there. I have beans and cherries and coffee grounds in there. And this is some oatmeal that does not smell very good. Can't just leave that like that. I could, but then I'd probably have wildlife problems. I added about 2 of these, so that means that I need about 4 of those containers of browns to add to the top of this. I'm trying to kind of loosen them before I add them to my pile. So I'm just going to cover the greens that I added. And there's some stragglers. You can worry about that or throw them back in. Might add a little more to that. But that's kind of the start of my pile. And if I were to check on this maybe tomorrow, the center of it's always going to be the hottest. And if it weren't feeling that way, you might need to just add more dry brown material at your next convenience. And if this were really, really full, again, the more I add to this pile, the more I need to stir it each week. When it's this small, it's kind of hard to stir, but you can kind of fluff it. So if I were to add more to it and don't need the pitchfork, I might just kind of, you know, move it around a little bit before I add my new stuff. So if this were really full, again, you would take this and I would be pulling things from the outside to the inside and just really trying to stir everything up that doesn't look like it's been decomposing, because you want that to get in the center of the action, because that's where the compost is made. So that's where all the microbes are. So here's my pile of finished compost. How do I know that it's actually finished and that it has the right amount of moisture in it? So there's still a few things in it like bark, which I'm not too worried about. But when I take it and squeeze it, it sticks together and I actually can see a little water bunching up, and that's perfect. That's what we're looking for, versus this, which I took from my pile that is older, and you can actually just see side by side a slight color difference. And when I squeeze this, the same amount, there's not really anything coming out. It's clumping together a little, but it honestly feels a little dry to me. I would want to add more water to this before I use it. So if I were to store my final product of the compost, I can keep it in my third bin. I could move it to a different spot in my yard. If I know I'm not going to use it this year, I might put it in a spot and then cover it with some sort of plastic, which is what I've done with this pile. And this is actually getting pretty compacted, but if I took a shovel or my spaded fork again and checked it out, it would probably be the right moisture content because I've kept it protected. Just store it in a spot that works for you, or try to use it or give it to your friends. This is my garden where I pulled all the lettuce out of, and you can tell that I've used the compost as a soil amendment on the top. I've mixed it in with potting soil, and before I replant my summer greens, I might sprinkle a fresh layer of my compost in here. Another spot in my garden where you can tell needs compost. It looks dark now, but in my cold frame here, there wasn't enough compost. It actually is, this is some compost, but it's kind of peat, I don't know what it is. So I would probably just add a layer of this before I replant anything in, and I would add a lot more and then stir it in. But this is an area where I'm lacking soil, and having my finished compost would be important. I'd have to determine the volume that I'm going to add. But to spruce something up, just a little bit of compost is good, but this I could probably add a lot more. Again, composting is a really great way for you to reduce your waste from the landfill, and to reduce the waste from your garbage pail. You can put it in your compost bin, put it in your yard, and in time and with a little love, you can put it in your garden. Then you can eat that and start all over again. So composting helps everybody out because it reduces the amount of waste going into our landfills. Thank you for watching this PSA. If you have any other questions about composting, you can contact the Bennington County Solid Waste Alliance or go to their website for more resources.